Here in the final presentation of the semester, I like to take the information you've learned about public speaking and apply it to the real world process of trying to get your foot in the door. Now, for many of you, getting a job is quite a ways into the future, but what I'm about to teach you applies also to getting into grad school or professional school or medical school, as well as to applying for internships and scholarships. All of this will apply to the process of being interviewed because even though an interview doesn't seem like a public speech, it's more likely to become like one for two reasons. First, a lot of interview processes include some kind of job talk or a time in which you give a fairly lengthy presentation. Some of you at George Fox might have even competed in the scholarship process that included a public speech. Also, even if it is a question, your response can still be governed by the structures we taught you about public speaking, especially if the question is a complex one. But we'll get to that as we get later into this particular presentation. So, for many of you, you're looking ahead. Now, the question is, how far through your college process are you? Now, research your profession. Anything you're thinking about doing is something you should read about. One of the most common mistakes people will make is that they will go from a misinformed perception of what their job will actually be like. For example, if you watch Law and Order and think that being a lawyer is going to be anything like that, you're probably in for a bad time. So make sure you actually find out about your profession before you set your sights on a particular goal. Just think about it in the same way you might have prepared for college. Think about 2 years ahead. If you think more than 2 years in advance, you can be a little excessive because the job market might change, the kinds of things you're interested in might change. But if you go for less than 2 years in advance, then you might not have enough time to do the things you need to do in order to get that job or get into that particular position. You might not have enough time to finish a major, for example. Take advantage of your professors. Many of them have contacts in the network of larger groups of people who actually do these jobs for a living, and they might have even had work experience that can tell you a lot more about what the day-to-day of the job would look like. These are the real world questions, the questions that actually say, okay, what does a lawyer actually do? Very few lawyers actually end up in a courtroom. In fact, in many professions, when it comes to the law, if you end up in a courtroom, it means you didn't do another part of your job well in the first place. The courtroom is the last place you want to end up. That's a real world response. Also, think of the networking your professors can get you. Many of your professors do have good contacts that can actually get your foot in the door somewhere, either in terms of an internship or that first job. And of course, you're going to need them for letters of recommendation. Always feel free to contact some of those professors, but make sure you do it to professors who actually have had some close personal experience with you. They'll write better letters. Also, they'll tell you about some of the tricks of the trade. For example, in communication, it's increasingly important that people learn at least a little bit about statistics because of how much research we're able to do about audiences now, which means we can do polling, just like the kind of poll that I posted today for the topics that you're going to be doing for your persuasive speeches. Being able to know a little bit about statistics will actually help you in the communication field. That's a small trick. Now, when it comes to internships, these provide great experience even if they're not in your field. Even if your experience at the internship is nothing but making copies and getting coffee for people, it still shows up on your record as being that you're able to work in a workplace, that you're able to follow instructions and be responsible. And of course, it can also help you rule things out. One of the best students I ever had was completely committed to becoming an anchor in the news, one of the on-air talking personalities. And after her internship, she realized that she actually had a lot more fun behind the scenes in terms of producing things, figuring out what kinds of stories to pursue, how to make technology work for them, things like that. So doing the internship helped her to improve her focus. And of course, your own internship process can result in better networking. A lot of students end up either getting their job through their first internship or through their boss's connections to their next job. Applying process. When you begin to apply to a job, you want to think about a couple things. Think about it as the initiation and experimentation phase of a relationship, right? It's the way you make first contact. It's like hitting on an employer. You're basically making them aware you exist and starting to get a feel for what the two of you are into. Your ability to follow rules is your primary concern first and foremost. A lot of people put tons and tons of effort into stuff that honestly doesn't matter. One of my earliest jobs when I was in college was helping in the admissions department, reviewing scholarships. And one of the weird things is how many times students would do all kinds of work on font and formatting and things like that, but they wouldn't spell check it. Being able to follow basic rules is the primary concern. Follow deadlines, make sure your application is complete, follow the instructions. Now, the other stuff's more important, obviously. Clearly, we want to learn to know you as a person, but remember, your application is often showing up on a desk with 100 other applications. You don't want to stand out because you did something wrong. You want to make sure you get your foot in the door by following the rules first and then wowing us later. When in doubt, do more than necessary. If you're not sure that you have good letters of recommendation, this is one of the rare times that I would suggest trying to go above and beyond the instructions and actually give them more than you might need. Be sure to check with people in your field about how the application process works. For example, one of the weird things in education is that a lot of the jobs that are posted actually aren't real jobs. They're simply jobs that somebody already has but technically have to be reposted each year because the person is only hired for 1 year. So even though Professor McGillicuddy might be the guy we know we're already going to hire for the position, we have to post it. So checking with people in your field will let you know about little weird tricks like that. Now, when it comes to letters of recommendation, you've got a few things to worry about. First, who should you get them from? My strong advice here is that you need to have 2 or 3 within your major or specialization. But then it's always good to have an outside member, somebody who isn't necessarily in that field who can speak to something that's unusual about you. For example, a lot of students who are on the speech and debate team that I coach aren't actually communications or business folks. Many of them are actually in political science, some of them are in economics. So by having my application associated with them, they might actually see, hey, this person isn't just good at economics, they can also speak publicly. How many should you get? What kinds? The closer you get to graduation, the bigger a file you should probably have of these, or a bigger list of contacts. You can also look into LinkedIn to create a network. Now, I know that LinkedIn probably isn't what you expect to want to use because Facebook or other forms of social media seem more appealing, but LinkedIn is becoming one of the primary focuses for letters of recommendation or endorsements. Now, when you provide the letter of recommendation, an important thing to do is to make sure that the recommendation is referenced in your application, the cover sheet that you actually put in, because that forces them to read the letter of recommendation. In many cases, they might not. So during your application letter, you might say something along the lines of, I have strong communication skills, as you can see, backed up by this letter of recommendation from my speech coach. Even if they don't read the letter of recommendation, you've now stuck your foot in the door and let them know, hey, this is a skill that I have and it's backed up somewhere. And one weird thing you might need to know about is blind recommendations. This is a recommendation process, especially now because of the internet, that is increasingly more common, where you will never see the recommendation letter that your person writes for you. So make sure you find good sources for this, because you don't want to be surprised by the kinds of things they might say about you. All right, now that you've actually got your application in, whether it's to a job, professional school, or an internship, you want to follow it up, but you need to make sure that that following up is more of being conscientious kind of following up as opposed to being a stalker. So contact them, but don't stalk them. A good way to handle this is generally to look at how you're going to be different. You don't want to stand out because you're the person who's bugging the person 3 to 4 times a day. You want to stand out because you're the person who seems to really have your eye on the ball. A good example of this is whatever the deadline is for applications is a great time to send an email maybe the day before just to verify that all your stuff is in. It's just a great little note that says, hey, I'm a super conscientious person who makes sure that I have all my ducks in a row. Now, when you do apply for this kind of stuff, plan for what can happen, not what you think, hope, pray, or wish will happen. A lot of people make the mistake of applying only to the 1 or 2 jobs that they desperately want, and they don't leave themselves a fallback position if those jobs don't come through. So think about fallback positions, alternatives, things that you could do in the meantime. And also think about the difference between peer and reach positions. Just as it's kind of dumb to apply only to one or two great positions, it's also not a great idea to not apply to a position that you think is simply above your means. I had a number of students over the last several years who applied to jobs that they thought were well outside of what they were actually qualified to do, and they not only ended up getting the job, but they ended up succeeding at it. And the worst case scenario is you end up getting an interview for a position, and it helps you learn what kinds of things you need to get better at to move up the food chain. Okay, so now we're getting to the public speaking portion of this. You got the interview, hooray, they're contacted you, they've set it up, you're now going to be interviewed by Skype or in person or whatever. The good news is, it's like the playoffs in most sports. Even if you weren't the best candidate going in or didn't have the best record going in, you can make up for it with a great interview. Right? History is littered with people who actually were not the best people going into the playoffs, but they really put on a great show in the playoffs. The same thing is true for a job interview. When I was teaching at Seattle Pacific University, I was part of the program that reviewed people who were going into the medical field. And it was amazing how many times the person's resume didn't match their interview. Occasionally we'd see a resume that was fantastic with an awesome transcript, and then we would interview the person and they couldn't handle even the most basic questions. Conversely, we would see people whose transcripts weren't that solid, but once we got them into interview, we could see that they were really going to be a great doctor, and we wanted to make sure that we helped them make that happen. Now, the bad news is, if you had a great resume, it's just like the playoffs. Even if you were the best candidate going in, you could really mess yourself up or torpedo yourself with a bad interview. So remember, think about the interview as a make or break, because that's really what it is. Make sure you cover all the basic details about the interview, place, time, method. That's one of the reasons that I emphasize following the directions of the public speaking class. It's just the same kind of real-world experience you'd need for the job interview. Make sure you know where you're going to be, what the interview is going to look like. Will it be a group interview? For this position here at George Fox, I was actually interviewed 3 different times in multiple different scenarios. Some were in person, some were on Skype, some were with multiple interviewers. So make sure you know those things going in. Know them and plan accordingly. Everything you do in the preparation phase will help you handle the communication anxiety that you might be feeling because of the job interview, and that will let you do what you really need to do, which is present yourself. Now, when it comes to responding to questions, I'm going to begin with some general tips, and then we'll focus down on some of the more common bad questions or tough questions. The number one mistake that people will make is they'll keep talking even after they've answered the question. And some interviewers will even do this on purpose, where they won't give you nonverbal feedback to let you know that you've finished, because they want to see how confident you are. They want to see, did this person really believe what they just said, or did they just keep talking until I nodded my head? So know when you finished an answer. Now, how does this apply to our public speaking class? It's just like the clincher in your speeches. The end of your speech shouldn't be something that trails off. It should be a clear ending line. The same thing's true for an interview question. Your answer should be a very clear statement that ends on a clear note, not something that simply trails off. Make sure you avoid run-ons, don't let the sentences get too complex, and trailing off, as well as powerless speech mannerisms. Things like might, maybe, like, anything that waters down the answer. Make sure you stay on the positive side of things. Many of us have tons and tons of stories about negative experiences, but if your interview is dominated by negative talk, it tends to remain in their minds as a negative feeling. So even though you might have been a great worker in every situation that you've described, the fact that you chose to focus on the negative experiences will stick in our minds. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be ridiculously over-optimistic. It just means avoid the negative topics unless they're specifically asked for. And also, avoid evaluative statements, meaning talking about things that you really enjoy or really don't enjoy unless they're specifically related to the current line of questioning. For example, I had one student who told me a story one time about how great an interview was going, and then some offhand comment came up and the person started talking about golf. And this person really didn't like golf. And he could see that the moment he said that the interviewer was not happy. that apparently the interviewer was a big fan of golf. Now, he still got the job, and they joked about it later, but think about how tough that would be if, because you just decided to suddenly start talking about negative emotions about something that had nothing to do with the job, you could have damaged that relationship. Make sure you've got your world at your fingertips during the interview process, because it's not uncommon for the process of a single interview to actually lead to other experiences. They might ask you things like when you can begin working, or when you can do shadowing, or things like that. If I ask you that question and you have no clue what your next week looks like, that's going to stick in my mind, and I'm going to remember you as the person who doesn't really have their world at their fingertips. You're going to be the person who doesn't seem to know what their schedule includes. Right? It's not uncommon for an interviewer to simply set up the next interview or a job talk, a visitation, shadowing, or observation right during the interview. So have whatever it is you plan your life on with you. And if you don't already have something that plans your life, like a day planner or a scheduling function on your phone or iPad, get one and make sure you get comfortable with it. Now, before we get into too many specific questions, there's one general kind of question that always throws people for a loop. There are certain questions that people cannot legally ask you. For example, when I was at the University of Washington, no one could legally ask me about things like my sexual orientation, my faith, if I had ever drank, things like that. But if I were to be hired for other jobs, those are completely legitimate questions. These are called bona fide occupational qualifications. Basically, the question is, are these issues that are legitimately required as a component of the job and are therefore fair game? Working at Seattle Pacific University and George Fox, both Christian institutions, it was totally natural for my faith to be an issue that was raised during the interview process. They would ask me what my background was and things like that, what church I attended. Completely legitimate questions in those circumstances, but not at University of Washington. Another example might be questions that ask about your weekend or family life. If you want to get a job in politics or PR, you're pretty much going to have to be able to work whenever they need you to work, because they can never be sure when things will turn up, right? If you're working on a political campaign and your campaign head says something stupid on air at Friday at 5 p.m., guess what? Your weekend's gone, because you're going to need to be there working through the whole weekend. So it's fair for them to ask you about family issues. Other jobs, it wouldn't be. So some jobs would allow questions that you would think are completely illegal. Make sure you understand what the requirements of your profession are. For example, things like marital status, your body, appearance, grooming, or clothing. Certain jobs in certain states have laws and requirements that actually allow them to ask questions you would think would be totally out of bounds. Things like religious views, obviously. The bottom line is, if you get asked a question that you think is illegal or out of bounds, don't freak out or hit the buzzer and think, hey, this interview is over. You should deflect it or answer it at your own discretion, but then reflect later on what that question meant. For example, I was once asked a question that I thought was completely weird, and it turned out later I'd simply misunderstood the question. It was the very first question in my job interview. Right before the interview, I'd been waiting in a waiting room, and there was an assistant who was out there who had, got me a glass of water or whatever. And when I went in, the very first question the guy asked was, "So, what do you think of my assistant?" And my reaction was, is this guy asking me about whether or not his assistant is attractive? And it turns out that no, a couple of interviewers before that had said that she was rude to them. And he was simply trying to follow up on whether or not she had been nice to me. So be careful about freaking out about a question. You might have misunderstood it. Now, if the question is totally illegitimate, then you might ask yourself later on, do you really want to work for that company? Or figure out how you want to handle that particular issue in the future. All right, now we can get to the most common types of questions you'll get asked in job interviews. Of course, just about every interview is going to start with the icebreaker, where they say something along the lines of, tell me a little bit about yourself, or tell me a little bit about how you got into such and such. These are annoying and tough questions, but everybody's got to start somewhere. My best advice here is to keep it upbeat and try to get through this question quickly, and even, if possible, steer the conversation to the topic of whatever job you're there to apply for. They might also ask you questions about your future plans. Now, the first step to answering this question well is to have one. The most common version of this is usually 5 years. I've heard 10 occasionally and even 20, but in most cases this will be a 5-year plan. If they ask you something beyond 5 years, feel free to respond that you hadn't thought that far ahead, but then give them your 5-year response. Another way to also respond to this question is to potentially end it with a question of your own. For example, I might say, well, during my first few years here, I hope to get acclimated and figure out this, and then eventually I'd like to move up into this other part of the job. And then I could finish by saying, what kinds of opportunities for advancement are there in the company, or what's the evaluation process look like? That way you're talking about the job almost as if you already have it, and you're simply trying to figure out how you'll be evaluated in the position. They might also ask you questions about what kind of tool you are in the toolbox, right? What kind of thing that you're going to be providing them. How do you stand out from the crowd? Other versions of this even are worded that way. Why should I hire you over other people, right? This is your best answer, and this is probably the one you've prepared for. This is the one most people prepare for, where they say, why should we hire you? Make sure that this is firm and confident without being arrogant. This question is much more about what kind of person are you? It's not so much why would you be good at the job, it's what got you interested in this job in the first place. Why did you choose this as a career? Or in another case, why do you specifically want to work at our company? These are a couple of really good application questions. The first one, why do you choose X as a career, just lets us know where your heart is on an issue. For example, I mentioned that I interviewed a lot of students for medical school, and one of the worst answers was always, because doctors make a lot of money. That's not really the reason why we want you to be a doctor. Yes, we're aware doctors can make a lot of money, but that shouldn't be your primary goal in becoming a doctor in the first place. And when it comes to wanting to work with the company, that's an opportunity to show some preparation, where you can actually have done some research about the company and talk about things they've done and how you felt about those things. So that can show your motivation for being hired. Now, a very common thing is that you'll actually see the interviewer looking over your resume during the interview, and they'll simply start cherry picking, where they'll notice something in your transcript and they'll ask you about a class you took, or they'll notice something on your resume and ask you about what kind of work you did at a particular company. Most important rule here is to simply go through everything you provide to them line by line and wonder about the kinds of questions they might ask and how you can steer those conversations back to the kind of person you are. Of course, you'll be asked a strength question. This is usually about job fit and uniqueness. Why are you better than other competitors at a certain thing? What do you consider yourself to be your greatest strength? Most people have that answer at their hands. But most people don't have a good weakness response. Weakness questions are usually something along the lines of, what do you think is your greatest weakness? Or what do you think is something you really need to work on? Now, when you respond to this, make sure it's a legitimate weakness. We hate the, well, my biggest weakness is I'm a perfectionist, or my biggest weakness is that I just, have trouble saying no to my bosses. These are just terrible responses. Instead, focus on something that you are aware of about yourself, and more importantly, notice the italics there, how you're fixing it. One of the best answers I had for those med school students was a student who wanted to do missions work, especially because his family did a lot of work in the Dominican Republic. And he was talking about how he wanted to improve in his Spanish because he doesn't speak Spanish very well. And then he said, and you'll notice that's why I'm taking some summer classes in learning Spanish. That's a great weakness response. He's aware of the fact that he needs a particular quality, and he's taking steps to get that quality. That's a great way to hammer the weakness question. And then, so many good interviews are ended on a terrible note because they will suddenly switch the game. After having asked you question after question after question, they suddenly flip the rules and say, do you have any questions for us? If you don't, say you don't. If you feel that that's a bad response, feel free to go into more detail and say, well, I don't have any questions right now, but who should I contact if I do? That's a great way to respond to this. If you do have some prepared questions, that's great, but make sure those questions aren't something that could easily be answered by a simple Google search. And don't start asking about things like, the pay or vacations or things like that. It tends to be that tends to be something that we would assume would get handled through the course of hiring you. It's not something you should ask about yet. All right. Now, you will probably be asked what is called a conflict question. And what this means is they ask you a question about how you've handled conflict. There's a couple ways this might go. They might ask you a question such as, when have you had a conflict with a supervisor? Sometimes they might even ask this as an ethical question. For example, how would you handle it if your boss asked you to do something that you thought was unethical? That's a conflict question. They could also ask you about a subordinate. If you've ever had a job where you were in charge of other people, they might want to see how you handle harmonizing a group or disciplining a member of the group or training somebody. And of course, they want to see how you handle problems with coworkers or peers. Occasionally, they might want to see how you might have helped resolve a conflict between others, a conflict that you weren't actually involved in, but you helped to harmonize the group. And of course, they might want to be aware of customer problems if you're working in a customer service type oriented field. And in special cases, you might have had a public relations case. All of these are examples of times when you saved the day because your boss asked for something unethical and you found a way to fix that particular problem. A subordinate screwed up and you found a way to make the customer happy, stuff like that. Now, all of these fit what is called the STAR response method. It keeps the response from getting to be too long, and it also focuses it on the right things. The STAR is explain the situation. That basically means tell us what the job was and what the specific conflict was. Explain how you figured out the trouble. Not just what the trouble was, but how you figured it out. Tell us what action you took, right? It can't just be a train wreck that you just tell us, yeah, that was a terrible day. It has to be something that you responded to. And then finally, tell us how it was resolved. This is especially good if it ends up changing how the company does its business in the future. For example, you might say, after that, we put in a new policy where now we do this thing instead. That's a great way to resolve it. Notice how giving yourself this nice four-step method keeps the response from rambling on too long. Make sure it's a good, clear, creative, and simple story. And if they ask for a kind of conflict that you've honestly never had, for example, if you've never had a subordinate and they ask how you have handled it, you could potentially either switch it and say, well, I haven't really had a subordinate, but if you're asking how I would handle that kind of conflict, here's an example. That way you're answering the kinds of things they're looking for. Now, these are my favorites. I love it when students go out into the workforce and they get some of these strange questions and send them back to me because there always seems to be a couple of common ones running around. Now, trained interviewers will apparently ask you what are nonsensical questions, but they're not doing it because they're just messing with you. They're doing it for several very important reasons. The first is they want to see how you think on your feet because a lot of jobs require you to operate independently. They can't hope that you're going to run to a supervisor every 2 minutes to resolve some problem. So they'll ask you a question that makes you uncomfortable specifically to see how you'll handle being uncomfortable. So a good example of this would be asking you a brain teaser or giving you some kind of puzzle situation just to see how you'll handle it. That kind of process lets us see where your brain goes when you get stumped, and that's often a really good indication of what kind of member of our team you'll be. Another thing they'll want to see is how your problem-solving process works, especially if I ask you a question that there's no way you could have known the answer to before you walked in. A common one that was making the rounds back in the 90s was people were asked how many gas stations are there in whatever state you were living in at the current time. And they wanted to see where your brain would go first. So you might have people who work it mathematically and say, well, I think there's at least one gas station for every so-and-so number of miles, so I'm going to guess this many, right? That's one way to go. And another one might be to be more logical and say, well, I know that all of the gas stations have to be inspected. And those inspections are probably through a government agency, so I would call City Hall, find out what agency that is, and get the number for you. Right? That kind of responding indicates the person has a really good view of the whole field and knows how to answer questions even when the answer isn't something that's just sitting in their own head. So the classic I got was how many gas stations are there in Seattle? Another one is they might want to simply get a new perspective on your personality. This helps them figure out what kinds of things you value, who you are as a person, maybe even things like what you do in your free time, how you'll fit in with the group. And this is, of course, the example from Fight Club. If you could fight anyone in history, who would it be? This is a ridiculous question, but it tells us something about you. It tells us who you value, it tells us what kinds of things you think are interesting, and that might be something I just want to see how you respond to. Now, when they ask these questions, the most common mistake you'll make is you'll be out of rhythm. Meaning, if I ask you 3 or 4 questions in a row that are totally normal questions that you have a fairly obvious prepared response to, you'll have developed a rhythm of answering only 1 or 2 heartbeats after I've finished asking the question. So I say, oh, it looks like you got an A plus in organic chemistry. Who taught that class? And you respond immediately. But then I say, if you were a member of a group of people who are making a salad, what ingredient would you be? It's going to be hard to answer that question in the same rhythm, so give yourself a second. They know they asked you a weird question, so they know that it's going to take you a moment to respond to it. Don't rush yourself. Be comfortable, demonstrate confidence. Don't act like it's a weird question. Act like you know why they're asking such an unusual question, and don't get upset about it. And what shouldn't you do? Don't make fun of the question. They know that the question is a weird question. They did it on purpose. And again, don't take it negative. So hopefully all of these tips will be ways that you could use the stuff you've learned in impromptu public speaking to answer questions well during a job interview and feel a lot more comfortable about your preparation process as well. So in the discussion for this week, I want to hear about some of your weirdest questions, either questions you misunderstood or questions that were just weird and you don't know how to answer them, or tough questions that were just really aggressive and mean and wow, there's no way to answer this question well. That's what I'd like to see in your discussion this week. All right, only 2 more weeks to go. Remember, the persuasive speeches are due by Sunday night, and I'll be giving you your feedback on your outlines later today.